Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Riverside Church's Reparations, Redemption, and Repentance series. I'm Reverend Bruce Lamb, the Minister of Faith Formation here at Riverside, and I'm joined today by Reverend Anthony Jermaine Ross-Allam and Jim Koon. They will both be our facilitators for this class, and we're so thankful to them for coming to us today via Zoom and for the next 2 weeks to lead us in this series. We will be recording this series portion of the class to be sent out to participants for the lecture portion of the class. If you don't want to be on camera, feel free to turn off your video, but just wanted to let you know we will be recording, so you can go back and watch, and we'll send out the recordings to participants later today or tomorrow. So before we begin, I want to tell you about our speakers, and you can learn more about them at trcnyc.org/RRR series. So Reverend Anthony Jermaine Ross-Allam serves as the Theology and Program Co-Lead with Restorative Actions, a grassroots volunteer initiative for churches, individuals, mid-councils, and agencies of the Presbyterian Church, and other ecumenical partners and interested organizations taking leadership in opposition to racism and racial privilege. Jermaine is currently a doctoral candidate at Union Theological Seminary in the area of social ethics. In addition to completing a dissertation on the social ecology of extralegal violence against African Americans after slavery, Jermaine continues to research the social, ethical, and theological implications of social attitudes regarding reparations and reparations advocacy. Ordained by the Twin Cities Presbytery, PCUSA in Minneapolis in 2012, Jermaine served as associate pastor at Kwanzaa Community Church and Oak Grove Presbyterian Church. He also holds an MDiv from United Theological Seminary. And Jim Koon serves as Treasurer and Financial Services Director at the Synod of Lakes and Prairies Mid-Council Leadership Organization of the Presbyterian Church, serving 16 presbyteries and 650 churches across the upper Midwest. In association with Restorative Actions, Jim has initiated dialogue with the Office of the General Assembly, PCUSA, leading to the creation of the Restorative Actions Working Team. Jim earned a BA in Economics at Claremont McKenna College and an MBA at the Fugo School at Duke University. He has held positions both in the banking industry, including head of national product management for Bank of America and president of TCF Bank of Illinois. Please join me in welcoming Anthony Jermaine Ross-Allam and Jim Koon. Thank you both for leading us in this series.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Take it away. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. So by way of beginning, I want to thank Eugene Molino and Reverend Bruce Lamb for your leadership and foresight in having this series and for inviting us here to talk, because this is a really important topic of conversation, and it's a great time, as always, to talk about doing the right thing. And we really appreciate you giving us the opportunity, letting us experience the honor of having this conversation with you all. I'll begin by way of halfway an apology. My camera is acting strangely, and so if all of a sudden you see the video cut out and you just see a photograph of me, please excuse me. It's not because I don't want to face you, but it's because I'm actually not looking forward to facing the Apple Store anytime soon, but I may have to do that. In our 3 sessions, we are going to talk about reparations, of course, but we're going to approach it in 3 different ways. And in this first session, we're going to look at social attitudes regarding reparations, what they have been and what they continue to be today. And so informally, we just entitled this first session, Delusional, Diabolical, Distraction. Our second session will look at the theological implications of reparations with the 3 JCs. Only one of which is Jesus Christ. But we will be looking at the theology, not only that helps us understand that reparations are necessary, but we'll look at some theological questions that will help us raise really important questions like, what are we saying about ourselves if we reject reparation out of hand? And then finally, in our third session, It's entitled Pointing the Way While Walking in It. And we'll talk about ways to participate in restorative actions that both allow us to practice what we say that we believe about justice and reparation, while also pointing the direction for our nation and for one another to the larger, very necessary national project for reparation. And I say pointing to it because it's very important that even as we engage in different activities that help to give back ill-gotten gains, the problems, to put it lightly, of slavery and Jim Crow and other issues related to the concept of race are indeed so massive that no ad hoc activity is going to put a dent in the problem. So we will practice actions that help us to do our part in restoring these ill-gotten gains, knowing that all along we are encouraging and pushing our entire nation to engage in doing what is right. So having said that, I will start just by talking a little bit about myself, not because I'm interesting, but I want you to know what part I play in reparations and what reparation has to do with my identity. And as you'll find throughout this series, you will also be in the same position to think about what reparation has to do with you in particular. So as you heard, I'm Anthony Jermaine Ross-Allam. I am the son of Anthony and Alice Ross from Willis, Texas. And I emphasize that because I am the descendant of people who were enslaved in this nation and emancipated in the middle of the 1860s. And I want to use a quote from Callie House to put my own self in context, but also to give us an understanding of the position that formerly enslaved people were emancipated into, by saying that I am a descendant of the 4.5 million slaves who were turned loose, ignorant, barefooted, and naked, without a dollar in their pockets, without a shelter to go out under, out of the falling rain, but was forced to look the man in the face for something to eat who once had the power to whip them, but now had the power to starve them to death. By using Callie House's words here, I want to emphasize what she says, stare the man in the face. And when she uses the term the man, I want us to understand that this man is Janus-faced, if you will. This is not just one face. This man is not only male, but is also female. He is conservative and liberal, a Democrat and a Republican, a Northerner and a Southerner, and he frustrates economic democracy by both legal and extra-legal means. So to follow what Callie House is really saying, we're listening to a woman with very little education who took in washing from wealthier people in order to pay her bills, but who decided that it was her job as a person who was born into slavery to do what was necessary to see that the people who were living after slavery had some dignified way of entering into old age, despite the fact that there was no political will to give reparations for slavery. So in a sense, Callie House is one of our first major figures in the reparations movement, although I don't know if she ever used the word reparation. But instead, she started an organization along with Josiah Dickinson called the Ex-Slave Mutual Relief, Bounty, and Pension Association. The work of this association was simply to have ex-slaves sign their name to a petition saying that they demand some restitution in the form of a pension. Callie House was made to understand by all sorts of public officials, including the Postmaster General, that absolutely no ex-slave pensions would be forthcoming. Nevertheless, she thought it was important to organize people in order to register the demand so that it would be clear that ex-slaves certainly understood that they were owed something and put forth the effort to organize to make it happen, even though people constantly explained to her that her idea was in fact ridiculous. I take it very seriously that she did this work when she was not necessarily, in her own words, intellectually equipped to do so. And I take very seriously that she did this work when it was much more dangerous, for her to attempt it than it is for me to stand here before you on Zoom and talk about reparations and relative safety and peace. I also take very seriously a woman who worked in the next generation named Audley Queen Mother Moore, who worked hard for reparations. She was also a member of Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. She was a communist, stopped being a communist when she realized that communists have absolutely no adequate analysis of race, but she was also an abbess for a religious order that she started. Queen Audley Moore sticks in my mind because as I studied her a couple of years ago, she made a comment that across space and time is addressed directly to me. And she complained that university educated African-American men in particular were forcing women like her, who she referred to herself as barely literate, to do work that she was not equipped to do, while instead focusing on poverty programs. I take this personally because she's right. Middle-class African-Americans during this time period shared the opinion of many white liberals that rather than look to the past, so to speak, it was more important to pay attention to how to arrange the present for the sake of the future. Meaning, the question was more important, how do African Americans integrate into white institutions that are segregated against them? So instead of take up this problem with reparations, beginning in the 1860s, African American middle-class folk, many clergy and most intellectuals decided to put this question of reparation on the back burner and leave it to people who, in their own words, were not that equipped to deal with it. I forgot to say this in the beginning. Please feel free to raise your hand or signal by some other means if you have questions. We'll have a Q&A at the end of this session, but you can ask any questions in the meantime. And I believe Reverend Lamb will select whose question it is. And just in case I'm glancing at notes, just yell at me and I'll pause.
One quick question in the chat. Merv asked, any chance some of the names that you've mentioned can be posted in the chat, or maybe we could email them out later?
Absolutely, I can definitely do that. That works. And so Callie House complained, as Queen Mother Audley Moore later on complained, that most African Americans who were in a position to do so did not help advocate for reparations. And for just a tiny moment, that included Frederick Douglass. But soon after determining that reparations are not practical, Frederick Douglass reconsidered. And then he said, and I quote, "The manner of liberation without shelter or restitution reveals a twisted and perverted sensibility." And then Frederick Douglass goes on to assert that repentance will not be genuine and complete until restitution is made. So aside from the common opinion, Frederick Douglass was a bit of an outlier, as he was in a few different places. He was able to notice at the moment that he understood reparations were impractical until he actually reconsidered the material conditions of the people and then realized actually emancipating people without compensation after generation of slavery itself is a twisted and perverted sensibility. And we should remember that. At the same time, Audley Moore and Josiah Dickerson's work unfolded during a time period when there was what I call a strategic laissez-faire moral policy with regard to freed people. After the Civil War, liberal abolitionist Henry Ward Beecher is just one example of people who described Thaddeus Stevens' plan to redistribute slaveholders' land to freed people as satanic teachings that were actually going to lead to destruction. And so this is Henry Ward Beecher, of course, relative of Harriet Beecher Stowe, ardent anti-slavery activists who nevertheless believed that reparations were so beyond the pale that they deserved to be referred to as satanic and diabolical teachings. Another person whose attitude is extremely important is Albion Tourget. Albion Tourget was actually a friend of African Americans, but he actually thought and said out loud that slavery itself opened to the slave a pathway to civilization and also the gate of heaven. And he warned that by insisting that the ex-slave is due something, the freed person nourishes, he says, a sense of injustice and ingratitude that distracts from the tearful recognition of their true status and duties of citizenship. So he understood that instead, Blacks should view whites with an unprejudiced and impartial spirit, rather than as cheats and unrepentant adversaries. So this is just to give us a sense of what the attitude toward reparation was during this time period. And it should be noted that Albion Tourget was, in all other regards, a friend of African Americans who, at some peril to himself, advocated for civil rights for African Americans, but simply thought that reparations was looking backward and it would actually distract from African Americans being able to win civil rights and other legal protections. So I don't want to paint him in too harsh of a light, but I actually want to associate him very closely with people who understand themselves to be people who take fairness seriously. And I do this just to underscore how much of a third rail topic reparation has been, and to underscore how difficult it is to take it seriously, despite the fact that people will let it be known that you make no sense and that you're probably a problematic troublemaker if you bring up reparation. Now, we fast forward to 1969 at Riverside Church. So this is probably something that is not a surprise to anyone at Riverside, but James Foreman in the spring decided to make his way into the church and demand reparation. And he demanded reparations at Riverside Church from not only Christian churches, but also Jewish synagogues for the history of depredations that African Americans experienced at the hands of European enslavers. And I note that he only asked for $500 million, which you can imagine, even in 1969, was a very, very paltry sum. But when we think about the social attitudes toward reparation, we have to remember that not much changed between the late 1900s and the late 1800s rather, and the early 20th century and 1965. His demands, of course, were not taken terribly seriously, although the administration at Union Theological Seminary was, shall I say, persuaded by an ardent student body to take those demands very seriously. And it was decided, in fact, by the board of directors at Union Theological Seminary to donate some money. And in various ways, Riverside also responded in the affirmative with various forms of support. I will say, however, some of the members, I'll say the letter writing members of Riverside Church and some of the ecumenical partners of the church responded in ways that I think are also very, very revealing to us. And I'm going to have to find a distinct section here, if you'll just give me a second. But I wanted us to spend a little bit of time listening to what the conversation was among those who saw fit to write letters to Reverend Campbell, who was the pastor that time at Riverside. But I'll begin with what Reverend Campbell had to say. Reverend Campbell had an interesting transition, and we'll say more about that in session 2. But Reverend Campbell began by, to a certain extent, belittling the idea of reparation, saying that, yes, it is true that African Americans have suffered a great deal because of slavery and racism, et cetera. But then he offered the congregation a kind of infinite regress, where he more or less says, if we start addressing each of these grievances one by one, then where will we end up? And I think that that's a very interesting question, because the question suggests that there is a certain amount of injustice after which no one should be counting anymore, but instead we should consider it a vague tragedy with no particular solution that any of us is bound to take seriously. But after a few months of thinking, Campbell had something very interesting to say. And so he says this to begin: I confess, I'm not sure how far we can extend this demand for reparation, or else we will find that we are all interlopers going back to the Garden of Eden. No one, in a sense, has a clear title to what he owns. And if the Black man can speak with concern about having been taken, then the Indian, no less, can make his claim as well. So in this sense, he refers to obvious injustices, especially the injustices toward Native Americans. And again, we will also discuss reparation for Native Americans. But I think it's telling that Campbell is not far from the average opinion. He may even be a little bit above or more positive than the average opinion, in the sense that there's a sense that there is an overwhelming burden that comes into our attention when we talk about reparations, and that we should not be impractical, shall we say, simply because of what has happened. But then, to his credit, on July 13, a little bit later, he says, we have failed collectively as white Christians, and we can make amends collectively. Campbell concedes that while no amount of money will repair damage to a man's soul, he says, our money can be an earnest of good intention and a hint at a new direction for the church and the nation. So again, he raises this question. Others also have claims, and he lists the American Indian, the Spanish American, and I believe he means also the Inuit, although he doesn't use the right term, and the deprived people of Appalachia. And he asks, where does it all end? He doesn't acknowledge his previous evasion as I see it, but Campbell does ask, what kind of logic is it to ask, where does it all end? He says, each case deserves its day in court before the conscience of the church and the nation. And I think there's something commendable, not only in where Campbell ends up, but there's something commendable about the process. He's able to state a very status quo opinion that's not very helpful, not very imaginative or courageous, but he comes back to the pulpit again and he revisits his former decision and he actually corrects it and he makes a step in the right direction. This, of course, absolutely infuriates some of the letter writing public associated with or actually attending Riverside Church. One person who actually wrote her name down, she says that we must free ourselves from the Black incubus. Another person says to Campbell directly that if you give in to these maniacs, you are helping to put our country on the road to ruin and degradation, and that you will be thrusting us into the folds of fascism. Another person writing to Reverend Campbell, after hearing that Reverend Campbell was actually thinking about responding somewhat positively to Foreman, this person gives a list which includes Eldridge Cleaver, Stokely Carmichael, H. Rat Brown, Dick Gregory, and others, and describes them as Black men who were communicating, quote, diabolical schemes for the eventual takeover of the country. Another white woman actually talks about a story in her family about a slave who they used to have very fond feelings for. And she said that the Black Manifesto simply contained false claims and that those people making those false claims were actually of the devil. And she wrote that she hoped that her letter would do some good, and so that the goings on of the devil will be put in their place. And finally, in another letter that is actually signed Sincerely a Christian, the letter writer asserts that Black people owe us for a chance in our white educational systems, our white civilization, which has subdued the earth to the greatest degree of any civilization yet, with the promise even of other worlds in this life. Use laws, he's urging Campbell, against these Black agents of Satan. So I'll note here that aside from how offensive it is to be called a Black agent of Satan, I mean, that's sort of obvious. But what's also clear is that referring to human beings as Satan means that whatever they're saying or whatever they're doing is actually throwing people off of the path of righteousness, or in this case, off of the path of progress. So if we can look past some of the obnoxious and clearly racist language, I think we can see a more mainstream opinion, which is that reparations is a part of what will distract the nation from moving forward in scientific, political, and social progress. this argument, which of course has two faces, like the face that Audley Moore, or pardon me, like the face that Callie House talked to us about, this face has two faces. It's both a conservative face and a liberal face that both can speak the same truth, but with different language. Doing right by African Americans means the end of America as we know it. To put it another way, doing right economically by African Americans is the death of a particular type of man, the American man, the man whose thefts are not thefts, but instead worthy sacrifices for a nation that is on its way not only to success and progress, but to conquer future worlds. So I give us this list of attitudes, not because I want to depress you or to make you feel like the problem is so impossible that we can't solve it. But I offer this list just to show that attitudes today are not that different from attitudes about reparation yesterday, although we use different language nowadays to arrive at more or less the same conclusion. Nevertheless, after this incident at Riverside Church, people continue to push for reparations. Pardon the ice cream truck and the dogs chasing it outside my window, if you will. But efforts for reparation continued with groups like NCOBRA, who began in 1987 to advocate for reparations. And of course, Congressman John Conyers in 1989 put forward the bill HR 40 and championed it, I think, every year until he finally died away, and until he passed away. And this was a bill that was proposing the study of reparations, and also it sought to develop a proposal for reparations that could actually be followed up. And of course, today, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee continues to support that bill, which now has 188 co-sponsors. I should also name the first Pan-African Conference on Reparations in 1993 also supported reparations from the perspective of the broader African diaspora. In 2001, the World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance was held in Durban, South Africa, where they also advocated reparations not only for African Americans, but for the broader African diaspora and those who suffered depredations under the colonial system. And their conference, which was controversial at its time, was also overshadowed by the terrorist attacks of 9/11 a few days later. They reconvened in both 2009 and 2014, but most Western nations boycotted those over many questions, not only the rejection of reparations, but also questions about how Zionism relates to racism. And there are many, many more instances. For example, CARICOM, I should also acknowledge the group of Caribbean nations who are also making their case for reparations to their former colonial powers in Europe. Ta-Nehisi Coates may be a more familiar name to you, however. His famous article, The Case for Reparations, made a big splash in 2014 and brought the case for reparations to, I think, a broader audience of people who were not in the habit of thinking about reparations. And of course, he had his notable detractors. And finally, our 2020 election, which was a very important election in many ways, found candidates discussing reparations in various debates, which included Kamala Harris, Marianne Williamson, Elizabeth Warren, and others, brought reparations to a stage where most people did not expect to hear about reparations. And that brings me to the close of what I wanted to say. And by speaking of this stage, the National Democratic Congress, that is, I bring them up because my friend Jim Koon, who's already been introduced, is another person who is important to me for all kinds of reasons, but especially because he is relatively new to the conversation of reparation. But he has followed, like many people, I guess, a movement, if you will, a movement of people reconsidering reparation for perhaps the first time, making a transition in attitude about what reparations sounds like to what reparations could be. And Jim, I will leave it to you.
Jermaine, thank you. I thought I'd share how Jermaine and I got acquainted. Jermaine was associate pastor at the church I attended, and pastor of the church that my wife was also an associate pastor there, still is. He and I had a chance to take a long car ride for a men's retreat. That was about a 2.5 hour car ride, just the two of us, and just get into discussion about things that we were passionate about. I think I probably started with my typical harangue about how America, as economy, was not growing as I felt that it had the potential to grow in the post-recession years, and the whys of that, and my frustrations and all. Jermaine, in his turn, who I knew was already planning to enter the PhD program at Union, shared with me that his passion for reparation is not a lost cause, and I, really in line with what some of the other reactions have been to reparation, I was nonplussed. I didn't know quite how to react. I knew what reparation was, but having never given it much thought, I had it in the mental category of a non-starter. It's so big. What does it even look like? Is it beneficial, or is it would it be detrimental, and all manner of things that I probably shouldn't worry about. But since that conversation, I really haven't been able to let it go. And see it, now start to recognize that, whereas Jermaine articulated it as perhaps a distraction from pragmatic process or progress in this country, it really an obstruction of America's progress and productivity. If you start to see our strength as a country as being the country that is that provides freedom and has diversity, but then you say, well, let's cut way back on the freedom of some of our members, you can realize that we are way short of what we could be, or what we could have been by now, and short of what we could be in the future if we really promote the freedom to participate, the freedom to take risk of all talent across the country. That's really where I see things. I look at I'm fairly math and financial oriented, so I immediately went to, well, what's the number, and trying to make some calculations there, but ultimately come to the fact that after 100 and whatever years after emancipation, if you look at the average wealth across our white households in America, and the average household wealth in African-American households and indigenous households as well, the 15%, at least 15% of my wealth as a white person can be traced back to, was really funded by the obstructions and past crimes against Afro-American and indigenous. It simply is in the numbers that big numbers don't lie. We're talking about 100 million households over 150 years, and with an equal distribution of talent. Why is it that one group through 1963 owned 97% of the assets of this country, and last year still owns 97% of the assets of this country from assets held by households in aggregate. Big numbers don't lie. There is a true obstruction and it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking for this country too, because we need to be growing. I think we can do much better, but I think we are seeing and we're feeling the pain, as well as the diminished productive capacity, diminished intellectual wisdom that we could have if we had not restricted 15% of the country's talent base. So on the one hand, it's just not right. On the other hand, I think it's a fallacy to think of reparation or some resetting of financial or catch up of financial as a zero-sum game. It's not a zero-sum game, and it's also, I don't know what it looks like. I know rough numbers, and it's huge. It's probably $12 trillion. I don't know what it looks like to address it. But this conversation that Jermaine and I had a couple of weeks ago, 1963, Kennedy knew that whether it was true or not, he knew that we needed to get to the moon. Had no idea how we're going to get there, and that was just preposterous. But began a mindset that we need to get to the moon, and we have got the talent to figure out how to do it, even though we can't fathom what it even looks like, or what the first steps look like, or any kind of a work plan. But I think that looking at today, it has growth as across on a collective basis, as well as been hurtful, and it remains something that is just embarrassingly difficult to look at today. I think it's time we start to believe that it needs to be addressed. It must be addressed, and even though we don't know what it looks like, we can address it if we start to have that mindset. That's really Jermaine's my hope in these conversations, is to impart that mindset of we need to and we can. Let's get at it.
Jim, I'm so glad that you pointed here. Oh, sorry, did I cut you off? I didn't mind.
No, please. I was hoping somebody would jump in.
Okay. And as we wrap up our section before the Q&A, one of the things that Jim and I both wanted to point out is that this sense of impossibility has a lot to do why otherwise well-meaning people look at something like reparations and just consider it to be something in the extreme. And if you remember, one of those letter writers from Riverside back in 1969 even made a comment saying that the nation had progressed so much that it was on the way to conquer other worlds, and that reparations would be a kind of distraction. And of course, that reminds me of the Gil Scott-Heron song, Whitey on the Moon, where he talks about the fact that his sister lives in a place that is so decrepit that rats are biting her face, yet Anglo-Saxon human beings have been able to get the money and the expertise to make it from this planet to the moon. And I think what Jim is saying is so important. The intelligence and the imagination necessary to get to the moon is probably takes less expertise to figure out how to do right by the descendants of enslaved people and how to engage in sovereign to sovereign relations with indigenous peoples. But because we feel that it's impossible and we feel that it gets in the way of simpler things that are important to our national identity, we then don't take the time to figure out that we simply have to create new possibilities. We can look at what's impossible scientifically and figure out how to engineer our ways into making the impossible possible. But with economic democracy, we have not found a way to do that yet, and we simply must do that. We have to put the energy that it takes to say something's impossible and reverse it, and put just as much energy into saying that it's both necessary and possible.
Jermaine, if I could, I think, you know, part of the enormity of the challenge, or the abstractness of the size of this challenge, when we think about the, you know, just the dollars, is that it is going to require the government to own up and to see the opportunity and to make the investment that really should have been made a long time. We shouldn't look at this as you know, as beyond the pale, as Jermaine said earlier. Is so big because it's not. It's going to require the government to do it. If we look at the benefits of what has been denied others, the benefits to those who have been privileged of certain favorabilities, and you know, on going through and examining my life, you know, if 15% of the average white household's wealth is wealth that would not have been available if wealth, I can absolutely see that at least 15% of what I have is owed, and that's the mindset. I would not be inclined to let the government off, because, you know, I may not have caused some of this, but at least in my lifetime, I have certainly benefited American. That's the right thing, and for the government to see, well, you know, the people are starting to recognize that this is owed, that this is an investment in America's future, that as many of us have felt for the last 10 years, we are underachieving our potential. And I think that this is a big reason why, and an accelerating reason why, and it's only getting worse. The disparity between wealth of white Americans and Afro-American and Indigenous Americans is widening. And it's because wealth begets wealth. Wealth is necessary for the ability to take risk and to participate and to jump in and have full participation in you know, bringing this country to what it can be. I would not let our predecessors of last century or the government representing them, but I believe that there's a responsibility that we individually have if we are in that group that has benefited at the cost of others.